Welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 22 of The Kill File. First off, I want to say just how grateful I am for all of my listeners, and I am so thankful that you guys are coming back each week and listening to me blab on about a true crime case that I find so fascinating, because that is why I do this. No one in my life gets as excited or interested in true crime as I am, and I just wanted a community of people like me who find this stuff as fascinating as I do to talk about this with and maybe learn a little along the way. So thank you so much for continuing to spread the word, and I hope that you will continue to do so and share things and follow along on social media as well. Also, I wanted to make sure to throw out that I have recently made a Blue Sky account for The Kill File, so for any of you who jumped off X back when it was bought or are making the switch now, The Kill File is now on the new Twitter. That's called Blue Sky if you're on there and you want to see extra pics or whatever from the cases. Okay, so today's case is going to be an oldie, which I'm excited about. Sometimes with older cases, it's hard to find a lot of information, or sometimes there can be some conflicting information, but I do my best to check everything out, and I'm finding that within the true crime world, I really enjoy some of the old-timey killers, because like the 1800s or the early 1900s is just a wild time to me. And the thought that someone could just do this stuff without the technology that we have today is just so scary to me. And I can't even imagine having lived back then and being lucky to still be alive. Today we're going to talk about a woman serial killer named Louise Peete, aka the Duchess of Death. Today's trigger warnings are going to be the usual for true crime, murder, suicide, etc. So let's jump in. Born with the name Lofi Louise Preslar, Louise was born into what was considered a wealthy family back in 1880 in Louisiana. So it was said that although her parents were well off and paid lots of money for her to get the best education possible, Louise was expelled from this great school that she was at for her bad behavior that was quote-unquote deemed inappropriate. It was also said that somehow jewelry that had belonged to several schoolmates was somehow found in her room, which was part of the reason that she was expelled from this finishing school. Also, I think I love the name Lofi. It seems like a cute, old-fashioned little schoolgirl. It was said that one of her parents, I'm assuming the father because of the 1800s of it all, was the publisher for a socially prominent newspaper. When Louise was expelled from her, quote, posh finishing school, she returned home to Bienville. In 1903, Louise would go on to marry a man named Henry Bosley, who was said to be a traveling salesman. It was also said that Henry had spent so many lonely nights on the road and had dreamed of the perfect wife. While the couple was living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Louise would be caught and arrested when jewelry that had belonged to other people staying in the same boarding house would be found in Louise's drawers. Due to Louise's apologies, full of tears and clearly being embarrassed, she was able to come up with some explanations, and the couple was able to leave and head to Waco, Texas. While the couple was living in Waco, Louise again would not be able to stop her compulsions for stealing when she would be caught with her actual hand inside one of the showcases that was owned by a local jeweler. This woman must have just loved the shiny things in life. She could not help herself, I guess. She must have been really good at being able to convince and talk her way out of the situations that she got herself into, as again she used tears and also some of her husband's salesmanship to gain a suspended sentence and a mere warning from the local judge. While the couple was in Dallas, Texas, for Henry's job, he would catch Louise cheating on him. He would find her in bed in the year of 1906 with a local oilman. Having upset this man to the greatest extent, it was said that Harry would commit suicide 2 days later. Henry was found with a .32 caliber pistol in his hand. Now, it was mentioned that Henry would say things to Louise like, quote, "Don't ever love another man, honey. I'd go crazy, maybe even kill myself if I ever found out that you didn't love me." Was it a suicide or something more nefarious? After this incident, Louise would go on to sell Henry's belongings, and she would then move to Shreveport, Louisiana, where she would work as a sex worker until she had enough money to go to Boston. After the big move to Boston, which was said to barely faze Louise, as she was able to now work as a quote-unquote high-class sex worker at the young age of 20. Which, get it, girl, you do what you gotta do, and I would like to think that if I was ever going to be a sex worker, that I would have been bougie enough to be a high-class sex worker. Louise was known to be the type of sex worker who made house calls, which was very brave of her, and she became one of the favorites for the local gentlemen. Louise, however, was still a bit of a klepto and was also known to steal from her clients, which is shitty, but also so risky. It was said that Louise would steal jewelry from wives who were not there while she sexually entertained wealthy clients. She would then sell the jewelry that she did not want to keep for herself, so she would make some extra money. Eventually, her luck ran out and she would be caught doing this, and she was threatened to be exposed, so she decided to quote-unquote retire to Waco, Texas. What it actually said was that an old dowager found Louise with her hand inside of the family jewel box, and this is why she left in a hurry to Texas. By the way, dowager, because I had to look it up. I've heard the word, but I don't know why. I thought it was like family money given to one of the family members. I also thought the word was dowager, but it's actually dowager. Yeah, I'm an idiot. A dowager is a, quote, serious-minded older woman, especially one who is a wealthy widow, end quote. While in Texas again, Louise would meet her next husband, whose name was Joe Apple, and he was said to be a wildcat oil man who was not only wealthy, but it seems that he was flashy as well. He would wear rings that were studded with diamonds, and so were the buttons on his clothes, and also his belt buckle. Now, there were some conflicting stories from different sources that said either her and Joe were married, or other sources would say that they were just simply involved with one another. Either way, not long after the couple met, Joe would be found dead with a bullet in his skull, and of course his diamonds were missing. Louise was accused of killing Joe and was called in to appear before a special grand jury. Here, Louise would admit to the shooting of Joe. However, she said that it was entirely in self-defense. She explained that Joe had tried to rape her, and this forced her to shoot and kill him. Apparently, the fact that his jewels were missing fell by the wayside, and it was said that members of this jury actually openly applauded her as she was set free. Wow, she must have been one hell of a liar. By the year of 1913, Louise was said to be running out of money, and she would go on to marry again, this time to a man named Harry Farrout, who worked as a hotel clerk. This was, of course, deemed to be a marriage of convenience, and soon Harry would find his bride committing adultery. This supposedly led Harry to commit suicide by hanging himself in the basement of where he worked at the hotel. I am just so confused. Like, are these husbands really killing themselves, or is she killing them? I mean, we know she killed Joe, but if she did kill Harry, how in the hell did she make it seem like a suicide by hanging? Did she just use a gun to threaten him into the position? Did she have any help? I have so many questions, and in the very off chance that they really were killing themselves, then what the hell does this woman have that makes these men not only marry her, but then commit suicide by the mere thought of their wife cheating on them? I just don't think these were suicides. Following the death of her husband in the year of 1915, Louise would then move to Denver, Colorado, where she would meet and marry a man named Richard Peete. Richard was a door-to-door salesman, so he didn't have a ton of money, obviously. Louise and Richard would go on to have a daughter in 1916. Unfortunately, Richard's less than impressive income was just not enough to keep Louise around, and she would abandon Richard and her daughter in 1920, when she would then head to Los Angeles. That's so sad, and her daughter did not deserve to have such a shit mother who would abandon her. No child deserves that. It was said that as the business downfall continued, Louise had decided that she had had enough of this life. She went to the bank account that her and Richard had, which was almost bare. She headed home and packed. Richard had come home as Louise was leaving, and he said, quote, "Going on a trip, my dear?" To which Louise replied, quote, "I think I need a change of air, Richard. Perhaps it would be better if I took a trip to Los Angeles, better for both of us." When Louise got to LA, she would answer a job ad in the newspaper of a man named Jacob Denton, who was in need of a housekeeper. Louise would go on to tell Jacob she didn't need to take the job, but that she looked at his large house as a challenge. Jacob then asked if she would take $50 a week plus room and board. I guess Jacob was a recent widower, which is why he needed the housekeeping help. Louise accepted the job, and while snooping in his house one day, she found out that not only did Jacob have over $100,000 at what was called the Farmer and Merchants National Bank, but that he also had a diamond ring and a 3-carat diamond pin. So this dude was rich. It was said that after a few weeks of a whirlwind, hot and heavy sexual relationship, Louise asked Jacob to marry her. But unfortunately for her, Jacob refused her offer. Louise played it cool as though the rejection did not bother her, but unfortunately for Jacob, this would prove to be a fatal mistake on his part. I mean, it's not a mistake that he didn't want to marry her, but Louise would take it as a mistake on his part and act accordingly in her own twisted head. At some point, Jacob had announced that he needed to go on a business trip to Arizona, and Louise would take this as her chance to act. Not long after, Louise would make the request of Jacob's caretaker to put a ton of soil in the basement of his home, where she would claim that she wanted to grow mushrooms for Jacob because he loved them so much. This was to be a great surprise for her quote-unquote lover. Around the time of May 30th, 1920, Jacob would no longer be seen and was considered missing. For people who had asked where Jacob was because they had grown suspicious or curious as to what was going on, Louise had a myriad of explanations as to what happened to Jacob, most of which circled around the fact that Jacob's arm was amputated and he was then embarrassed. She's wild. On June 6th, so just a few days later, Louise had Jacob's bank key to his safety deposit box, and she was ready to take out what she found. When the vice president of the bank would not allow her to do so, she then tried to cash a check that Louise had said was written by Jacob. When the bank realized that the signatures didn't match, they refused to cash the check and asked where Jacob was. This is when Louise would tell him that Jacob had left with a quote-unquote Spanish-looking woman, and that this was the sole cause of all of the strange happenings. She then added that her employer, Jacob, had had a fight with this woman just one night before he was leaving for Arizona, where Louise said she heard a lot of shouting and she also heard a shot. She then told him that the next morning when Jacob left for his trip, his arm had been in a sling, and this was probably the reason for his amputation. Then she went on to tell people that Jacob had had a fight with this woman, who was quote-unquote Spanish-looking, and when she did, she would start to embellish a little more. She said that the woman became so angry and enraged that she actually chopped Jacob's arm off with a sword. Like, what? So this supposed Spanish-looking woman not only had some kind of vendetta against Jacob, or was angry to the point where she didn't kill him, but instead chopped off his arm. And with a sword? Like what, she just happens to carry this sword around? Wow. So Louise then said that Jacob did survive the ordeal, but that he was so embarrassed by what happened, and the fact that his arm was now gone, that he decided to go into hiding. It was said that when Jacob's lawyer was pressing Louise about Jacob's whereabouts, that she had changed the story a bit, and this is when she would tell the lawyer that it was actually a leg that this woman had chopped off. She then said that once Jacob was comfortable with his new artificial limb, that he would return home. Like, shameless. She couldn't think of anything better than these bullshit stories about chopped off limbs. I mean, come on, man. Those aren't even good lies. Crazily enough, though, she must have sold the stories well, because these tall tales kept people from asking about Jacob's whereabouts for apparently several months. After this, Louise would go on to be called Miss Denton, and it said that she was known to have thrown some luxurious, elaborate parties in Jacob's home during his quote-unquote absence. I guess it was said that Jacob had actually had a daughter from his first marriage who was in school in Arizona, and when she didn't receive her monthly allowance, she wrote to her cousin, who would then seek out Louise. Louise was able to keep the cousin at bay by reminding her that Jacob would always become angry when someone meddled in his affairs. In September of that same year, so Jacob was last seen around May and it was now September, His lawyer, who was hired by Jacob's ex-wife to find him, became so suspicious that he ended up calling the police like, yeah, something isn't right here. And he called the authorities to help him search Jacob's home. I feel like this must have been some sort of like mansion or at least a very grand large house for him to need a housekeeper and that he could keep her for room and board in her own part of the house and for the people who were searching for Jacob to need help searching the home. After about an hour of the police digging in what would be the basement and all of the dirt that Louise wanted to quote-unquote grow mushrooms in, they would happen upon Jacob's body in the basement. They would find that he had a bullet in his head. This is probably gross to say, but wouldn't you think that that would smell so bad? Like, it didn't say that he was wrapped in anything or that there was like anything else down there to cover the smell. The smell of decomposition, I have heard, is unmistakable and very putrid. So with those parties that she was throwing, I can only imagine that it was pretty stinky in the basement and no one noticed the smell. Okay, I know this is morbid, but the description of decomp is something that comes up a lot, like in regards to the smell. And many people say that it's something you will never forget. So I am always curious what that's like. Like, what is the smell that so many people describe and say is unmistakable and memorable? Like, I want to know what that's like. Well, let me tell you. So we have baby bunnies running around each summer, and one day my kids come running in to tell me that there is a dead baby bunny in the backyard, which is so freaking sad, and it skeeved me out so badly to have to bag it up. I had gloves on and I had the little trash bag, but it took me a while to get up the courage to grab it because like its eyes were still open and for some reason holding dead things freaks me the fuck out. Like I just can't. So I get up the courage because I don't want it out there with my kids and I wrapped it in a few bags and I threw it in like the big trash thing that the city picks up. Well, a few days later we started smelling this like, oh, what in the fuck is that smell? Oh my God, let me tell you, the smell of this decaying bunny in a bin in the hot sun was a smell that I will never forget. And it was the strongest, grossest smell I've ever smelled in my life. And I used to be a CNA at a long-term care facility where we had to actually like burp colostomy bags outside. It smelled so bad. So I have smelled some nasty stuff before, but the smell that was coming out of this bin with the rotting bunny was like anything else. And despite the cleanings of the trash can, like I cleaned out the trash can, I filled it with bleach water, I let it sit there, I sprayed the holy shit out of it, it still was rank. Like for days, this thing had smelled so fucking bad. I think also what happened was that it was at the bottom of the trash thing, and then when the trash people came, it didn't come out with the trash, like it was like stuck at the bottom. So I feel like I got a little taste of what that could be like, but of course, being the curious cat I am, now all I can think is the smell of decomp roadkill the same as like decomp of a human body? I looked it up, and someone was saying, if I remember correctly, that they didn't think it was the same smell. And now my curious brain is like, if that's the worst thing that I have ever smelled in my whole life, then what the fuck does a decomposing human body smell like? Wow. Anyways, back to Louise. So after the police found poor Jacob's body in the basement, they were on the hunt for Louise, who had headed to Denver. She had apparently gone back to her husband and daughter and was said to have resumed her, quote, life of wedded bliss with Richard Peete. I can only imagine that with a woman and murderer like this, that their life was anything but bliss being married. When the authorities found Louise, they were able to convince her that they just wanted her to help back in LA to find the killer and that she was able to do this. This is when they would question Louise as she embellished the story of the Spanish woman, and the police weren't buying it. Louise was convicted of a murder charge in January 1921 by an all-male jury. She was then sentenced to life in prison. In the beginning of her prison sentence, her husband Richard and her would write back and forth often. Unfortunately, somewhere along the way, Louise would stop answering Richard's letters. In fact, several went without return responses. In 1924, it was said that Louise's husband Richard would commit suicide. What in the actual fuck? This woman is in prison and people are still committing suicide because of her? I don't understand. Like, is it really that they're committing suicide? And also, why? Especially to this one, because he has a fucking daughter. And this woman is in prison, for fuck's sake. Like, let her go. Oh, it's so sad. A man named Clinton Duffy, who at the time was the warden of San Quentin Prison, said of Louise she projected, quote, an air of innocent sweetness which masked a heart of ice, end quote. Louise was said to like boasting about the men that she had driven to suicide, which is gross. What a fucking monster. She was particularly proud of Richard's suicide, as she would say that not even prison was able to contain, quote, her fatal charm. Apparently, in 1933, Louise would be transferred to the prison in Tehachapi, and it was said about 6 years later she was up for parole again. One of the parole board members had spoken to a reporter from Louise's initial trial, and this reporter told the board member, quote, that woman is too dangerous to be set loose on society again. She's managed to exist all of her life by stealing, by lying, by violence. Mark my words, if you turn her loose, it's going to be tragic for someone, end quote. The parole board member named Emily Latham then said in return to this statement, quote, that's the trouble with you newspaper people. You just can't believe prison can reform a person, end quote. It was then said on April 11th, 1939, Louise was free and walked out of the prison. When Louise was paroled, she reported to her parole officer, Emily Latham. This is when Louise would be allowed to take the name of Anna B. Lee. I guess this was the name of her favorite movie star. She was able to find a job at a serviceman's canteen in World War II. I assumed that this was just a bar for servicemen in the military at the time, but when I did a little research, these canteens, quote, offered servicemen nights of dancing, entertainment, food, and non-alcoholic drinks, and even opportunities to hobnob with celebrities, end quote. I was pretty sure I knew from context what hobnob meant, but you gotta admit that it sounds dirtier than it actually is, right? Hobnob? Like, what the fuck? But yes, it does mean to just interact socially or hang out with people who were famous or important. In the year of 1942, there was a co-worker of Louise, or Anna now, who was elderly and had ended up vanishing. Her home was found ransacked and in complete disarray. When authorities started their investigation, they wanted to speak to Anna Lee, who was said to be this woman's best friend. The authorities were told that this woman had died from injuries that were related to a fall she had. Unfortunately, the authorities bought this story and they never did any kind of check on Miss Anna Lee's background or even obtain any kind of certificate of death. After Louise's parole woman, Miss Emily Latham, fell ill, Louise moved in with Emily to help take care of her, but unfortunately, Emily died 2 weeks later of a stroke, this being in 1943. Louise was then paroled to longtime friends Margaret and Arthur Logan. In fact, they were such good friends that they actually visited her often while she was in prison. When Emily Latham died, the Logans offered Louise a job as a practical nurse for Margaret's husband, Arthur, who was said to be near invalid. So I always thought that the word invalid was something mean that people said to people with disabilities. I had to look it up to make sure that that's what it means. And I read that it means like a person who is weak or actually disabled by an illness or injury. Did you guys also think that it was like a mean term? I got stuck on this for far too long and I went down a rabbit hole on a Reddit thread. Moving on. Arthur was 75 and in need of some help, so after the parole board approved her new position, Louise was able to move to the Logan's home that was said to overlook the ocean in Pacific Palisades, which apparently is a neighborhood in LA. Sorry if I butchered that name. Not too long after Louise had moved in, her and Margaret were having the discussions of whether or not Margaret should have Arthur committed to a mental institution. After this, Louise would go on to meet a man named Lee Borden Judson, who was an older banking man. Within the first week, Lee and Louise would be secretly married. This would happen in May of 1944. I guess this was a secret because it would be a violation of her parole. It was said that Margaret welcomed Lee into her house as a friend of Louise's. That same spring, Louise would start to build a case against Arthur by spreading rumors to friends and relatives of the Logan's family, saying that Arthur was getting out of hand in a dangerous way and needed to be committed. Apparently, the friendship between Margaret and Louise would feel some stress when it was found out that Louise had forged a check in Margaret's name. A bad check, in fact, in the amount of $200. Margaret then told the bank that the check would be made good, but then she told Louise that it was going to be her responsibility to make good on it. Louise made an effort to raise the money, and I guess she even asked Lee's son, who I guess refused. On May 29, 1944, Louise told Lee to stay at the hotel in which they were living, called the Glendale Motel, while she went to discuss some business with Margaret. Margaret would never be seen or heard from again after this day. Louise would go on to tell Margaret's husband, Arthur, that Margaret was actually in the hospital, but that she was unable to have any visitors. In early June, Louise had sold the story to what was said to be a probation officer from the psychiatric ward about Arthur going mad. She said that Arthur basically lost his shit, he hit Margaret in the face, and he even bit her severely on her nose and on the neck. She then told this person that these two women could not handle Arthur alone, and on June 5th, there was a court order that sent Arthur to Patton State Hospital for the insane. Over the coming weeks, anytime a friend or a family member would call or stop by to see Margaret, Louise always had some kind of excuse as to why she couldn't come to the phone or the door. She was said to often either say that she wasn't home, or she would say that Margaret didn't want anyone to see what she looked like after Arthur had disfigured her with his attacks. Sadly, on December 6th, Arthur would die alone in the hospital, believing that his wife had him committed and then left him alone to be miserable, which is just so sad. That poor man. Louise then told the authorities to turn Arthur's body over to medical research, which she claimed was Arthur's wish. We don't know for sure if those were Arthur's wishes or not. I hope so, but for all we know, Louise just didn't want to deal with his remains. I personally think donating your body to science is one of the best things that we can do after death, as it can help to further medical and scientific research, and I would even donate my body to a body farm to help them learn how bodies decompose in specific ways. It helps solve murders. If you don't know what a body farm is, you should look it up. It's really neat. After you donate your body to science, you get the remains back, cremated, which is what so many of us want nowadays anyways. Like, I myself will be proud to follow in my own grandmother's footsteps and do this as well, hopefully after I donate all of my organs. So after sending Arthur's body away, Louise would move herself into the Logans' home with her husband, Lee Judson. Lee was the elderly bank manager, if you remembered, that she married back before Margaret went missing. Not long after they moved into the Logans' home, her husband Lee found a bullet hole in one of the walls of the home, as well as a suspicious mound of dirt that was in the garden. Lee would also go on to find an insurance policy where Margaret Logan had supposedly named Louise as her sole beneficiary. For whatever reason, Lee never said anything and kept his findings to himself, which to me was weird. If I found a bullet hole in a house that I newly moved into, let alone a suspicious mound of dirt in my garden, in the house that a person had left my spouse in their alleged will, I would find myself suspicious of my spouse and I would check that shit out. Call me nosy, call me curious, call me whatever, but I am digging that shit up. I need to know who the hell I'm married to. By December of the same year, where all of these things happened in 1944, Louise's own parole officer was growing quite suspicious herself of the shakily signed reports, supposedly signed by Margaret Logan herself, in which the reviews were always coming out amazing for Louise, of course. Dude, it's too much. Flaunting how wonderful you are from a parole officer's point of view is going to get you caught. Like, duh. She should have just kept it simple. Also, it was said that they realized the handwritings were not a match over June, July, and August in those reports to the earlier reports. The police would eventually show up at the Logan residence to inquire about Margaret's whereabouts. Louise would go on to tell the authorities that Margaret was having plastic surgery done somewhere else. When the police asked why would she be having plastic surgery done, Louise explained that it was, of course, from the attack from Arthur, where he had bit her on the nose and the neck, and that she herself even suffered a bite. When they told Louise that they knew Margaret hadn't signed the reports since May, Louise admitted that she herself had signed them, but only because Margaret told her to. She said that since Margaret was away, that she was taking care of all of Margaret's business for her because she didn't want to be bothered with such details. After one of the officers pressed Louise to admit the truth, and basically asked her if she had lost her shit again and killed Margaret like she had done before. It was said that Louise said something about the sheriff in the LA County saying that this would happen again and that she would only talk to that sheriff. They put Louise into a vehicle to take her down to the district attorney, Fred Hauser. While the authorities were still in her kitchen searching for clues, one officer had saw what they thought to be a makeshift grave with a single white board sticking out of the earth as a headstone would. All of this would lead Lee to finally voice his suspicions as well. They would go on to find Margaret's remains in the garden, and of course, Louise spewed some kind of lie about how this all came about. One source said while they were unearthing Margaret's body, Louise was brought back to the house and taken to stand next to this makeshift grave, like to be forced to watch them find out what she did. It was alleged that Louise was exclaiming that she didn't want to see and that she would not look, and pleading with him to not force her to look. After more interrogation about her story of why Margaret was off getting plastic surgery, she finally admitted that she had made up the whole story and was just piling one lie on top of another. She did finally admit to burying Margaret in the backyard, but she refused to admit to the murder. She said Arthur had of course gone insane and beat Margaret to death in a murderous rage and shot her as well. Okay, Louise. Louise said that as she was afraid to attract any suspicion into her own background, she buried Margaret's body, and then she waited a whole month before having Arthur committed to the insane asylum. During the search of the home, investigators were able to find a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver that had the initials EBL inscribed in it. This gun was apparently stolen from Emily Latham, her parole officer that had died. The crime lab was able to reconstruct the murder after they were able to pull a smashed-up bullet which had traces of blood on it. They were able to tell that Margaret Logan had been sitting in a chair that was near the house telephone when from behind she was shot in the neck. It was then found that Margaret was beaten in the head with some sort of blunt instrument and that this would be the cause of her death. So at first I was wondering if she was shot like from behind. Did she even know that it was her friend Louise who did this to her? Or did she just die never knowing the identity of her murderer? But after reading the blows to the head are actually what killed her, I can only imagine that after the shot to the neck didn't do it, that maybe Margaret spun around to see what the fuck was going on, and maybe that's when Louise beat her to death. I don't know, but for some reason, knowing this was her supposed friend and that she came up behind her gave me such willies. This is why when I'm working on the podcast, which is all the time in my dining room, I have a giant mirror straight in front of me because I always wear headphones with some like coffee shop type music so I can focus and not be like singing the songs in my head. But when my family is home and I'm working on an episode, they used to scare the shit out of me sometimes coming up behind me or beside me. I am one of those people who gets fucking pissed when they get scared bad enough. Like, I feel like I am better about it sometimes, but I scare easily, and I don't know why. Like, even if I know someone's about to scare me around the corner, it doesn't help. I still panic and freak the fuck out. Is anyone else like this? Oh, and recently, I have figured out that I am a scared screamer of the highest order. Look, usually my family doesn't scare me so much because I have like heart palpitations and like some other little heart stuff. So we used to be extra careful, but for some reason, probably because I'm fine, and because I love to scare the shit out of my husband and my oldest son, my little heart shit has gone by the wayside, and now when I get scared, which is either by my kids or sometimes by my husband on accident, I legit scream like a little girl or make weird, loud-ass noises. Whatever, I'm still tough. One day I will share some funny-ass stories about moments in time where I got scared and some funny shit has happened, but those are for another day. Back to Louise and murder. So, Louise was, of course, charged with the murder of Margaret Logan. Then they actually charged Lee with accessory to murder on top of it. Lee was acquitted on January 12, 1945, but despite this, Lee Judson actually committed suicide. One source said that he was so grief-stricken about the fact that his marriage was now over and learning that his wife was already a paroled murderer that he went to an office building in LA, and once he was there, he went to the 12th floor and threw himself down the stairs. Another source had stated that the day after his acquittal, he actually jumped off the 13th floor of an old office building in LA. So, I dug a little deeper and I found a newspaper article from the Winona Republic Herald dated January 15th, 1945, and it said that neither of these things were true. But in fact, Lee plunged down a 9-story light well in a downtown office. When I looked up what a light well was, it said that they are usually open areas like a shaft. Like, I'm picturing like an elevator shaft. Except these are usually at the center of a building and usually have a glass roof over them, which brings in like natural light to the lower floors or even basements. Again, though, with the suicide, whatever curse this woman has on her has something to do with the deaths of these men around her, I swear. It was said that when Louise found out about her husband's reaction to not having her in his life anymore, she was pleased. Ugh, what a twisted bitch. If you really love someone, wouldn't you want them to go on without you and find love again? I mean, it's pretty apparent that this woman didn't understand what love was. Like, where is your daughter, dude? Eventually, Louise was convicted of the first-degree murder of Margaret Logan, and the jury that convicted her included 11 women. This time, Louise was given the death sentence. While she, of course, tried to appeal over and over again, she was unsuccessful. As the week of her death approached, there were still people who strongly believed that this woman was innocent of her crime or crimes. There were apparently fellow prisoners who wept for her as she had been preparing for her death. She was alleged to say to them, quote, "Don't be troubled, my dears. Death is merely an eventuality in all of our lives," end quote. It was said that the reason people always loved Louise is because she was so poised and nice and kind. But was she? I mean, she left this world with nothing but death behind her. Let's not forget this woman definitely abandoned her child and definitely killed some men. And the men she didn't kill killed themselves? Like what? She was led from her nearby cell with her quote-unquote spiritual advisor and matron named Mrs. Earl Snodgrass. Great name. I had to look up what the hell a matron was, and the definition that made the most sense here is a woman who actually supervises women or children, like in a school or a police station, so I'm guessing it's the same here. When Louise was led to the gas chamber, she would enter and be faced with, quote, some 80 men, one of the largest groups ever to witness a San Quentin execution, end quote. Here is where I begged the question, like, who the hell are all these men? I have a hard time believing that these 80 men are all people close to the loved ones that she had killed, right? So were they just looky-loos? I mean, no judgment here. I always wonder if public executions are something that I would have gone to myself. Don't judge me. I'm curious. I also wonder if I would be able to handle it or not. Am I the only one who thinks about these weird, morbid things? Actually, I know I'm not. There's a whole wealth of true crime lovers out there, and I've heard other people talk about weird stuff that they wonder too, so whatever. Louise looked at Warden Duffy and Mrs. Snodgrass and said, quote, "I'm ready to die." It was said that the release of the deadly cyanide pellets clinking into the tank of sulfuric acid let everyone know it was about to begin. Louise started to take deep breaths as she was told to do. It was said that she had selected the dress that she would be executed in, and it was said to be a print dress, and it had the pattern of flowers on it, which was said to be the same dress she wore to trial. So as I was researching this case, I knew that there were some states that had outlawed the gas chamber, saying that it was like inhumane or against the Constitution or whatever as a way of execution. And when I looked it up, it said that it was just Missouri and Wyoming that are the only ones left to do this. But we are going to find out later that is no longer true. That was of 2023, so I'm guessing it's changed. However, I didn't know why it was considered so brutal. So the only thing that I can compare this to in my brain before I was researching this was when I was in boot camp, I was forced to stand in the gas chamber, and they used tear gas pellets, I believe is what they were, and made us take off our masks, and our entire division had to stand there and hold up our masks in one hand and hold whatever fluids were coming out of our face in the other hand, and we had to say our name and our division number. Let me tell you, the first person to go was the one who struggled the longest because they had to sit there with their mask off in the gas room while the rest of us were dying of anxiety as our turns were approaching. Oh my God, let me tell you, that was not a pleasant experience, and I don't even know if they still do that. I doubt it. But they said it was for us to understand that if we needed to use this tear gas on someone, we would understand what we were putting someone through. I also remember narrowly escaping having to be maced in the face in combat training as I got out right before that happened. So lucky me. With that being the only kind of gas knowledge I have, I wanted to look into this further and see what the gas chamber entailed and how the executions would take place. Wow, were the descriptions gnarly. So I read that in Alabama, the gas chamber was first used in 1924, and for whatever reason, 100 years later, this year, in February of 2024, Nevada actually used a gas chamber to execute someone on death row. When looking at a chart on the deathpenaltyinfo.org website, you can see we haven't used gas a whole lot since 1976. As a nation, maybe like 11 times since then, and after 2000, there was none until the Nevada one this year. Interesting stuff. Okay, so according to that same website, it walks us through what happens at a gas chamber execution. So first, the person is strapped into the chair in what is hopefully an airtight chamber, although I have read that in the past, some have leaked. Right below the chair is a pail of sulfuric acid. This is said to be a colorless, oily liquid and corrosive to metals and tissue. Like, I looked up each part of this because that's how curious I was. There was said to be a very long stethoscope that is usually fixed onto the prisoner, and this is the way that the doctor can pronounce the death of the prisoner from outside of the chamber. Once everyone has left the gas chamber, the room is then sealed. This is when the warden will usually give the signal to the executioner, who then flicks a lever of sorts, which then releases crystals of sodium cyanide into the pail. Sodium cyanide releases hydrogen cyanide gas, which is known to be, quote, a highly toxic chemical asphyxiant that interferes with the body's ability to use oxygen. That is straight up from the CDC's website. After the pellets are released into the pail, the prisoner is instructed to take deep breaths, as this will help speed up the process of execution. However, many prisoners try to hold their breath, which I don't know if this is just like an automatic response or what, but dude, you gotta know you won't be able to hold your breath and get out of this situation. They have sentenced you to death. One way or another, it's gonna happen, right? It also says that some prisoners struggle. So here's the gnarly part. Apparently, the prisoner doesn't lose consciousness right away. According to the warden at San Quentin, California Penitentiary, yes, one and the same, Clifton Duffy, from Louise's case, says, quote, at first, there is evidence of extreme horror, pain, and strangling. The eyes pop, the skin turns purple, and the victim begins to drool, end quote. First off, oh my God, can you imagine seeing that? Like, I would have absolutely no idea what I was in for if I was watching one of these. Their eyes pop out? Holy shit. Secondly, I don't care for the way that he said victim, as if these people are innocent somehow. Poor choice of words, warden. Let's not forget that these people were sentenced to death by a jury of their own peers for crimes so heinous that they felt this person deserved to die for them. I guess there was a man in 1960 who told reporters that he would nod his head if it hurt while he was being executed in the gas chamber. It was said that this man was nodding his head for several minutes before he died. A doctor named Richard Traceman of Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine says the person is most definitely experiencing pain and some extreme anxiety. He states that the sensations felt is similar to what a heart attack feels like, where the heart is basically being deprived of oxygen. This causes the prisoner to die from hypoxia, which is when the brain is cut off from any oxygen. Oh my God, I can't imagine that feeling. The thought of drowning or dying in space where there's no oxygen for my lungs to get just skeeves me out so fucking bad. There is something to knowing how hard your body would struggle for air that would make me beg to be killed by a firing squad instead. Just shoot me. Fuck this hypoxia nonsense. Just end it. So after the prisoner is pronounced dead, there's an exhaust fan that sucks the poisonous air out of the gas chamber, and then the corpse is apparently sprayed with ammonia, which neutralizes any trace remains of the cyanide. After about 30 minutes or so, orderlies are sent into the chamber wearing rubber gloves and gas masks. I hope these people are paid appropriately because that would be a terrifying job to have. They are then trained to ruffle the corpse's hair in order to release any cyanide gas that could be trapped in there before they remove the corpse. Holy shit, that's insane, no? I went on reading about a new type of gas that was introduced as an alternative to lethal injection if the drugs can't be found, or if lethal injections is found to be unconstitutional as well. It apparently uses nitrogen gas for the executions, which I kind of remember reading about a while back. This would execute the prisoner also by hypoxia, and this would result in suffocation as well. They would basically place a mask over the prisoner's face and pump in the nitrogen, which would deprive the prisoner of oxygen and would result in death. So yeah, I thought you guys might want to learn along with me about how the gas chamber works, because I had no idea what the body went through as a result, and found that shit fascinating. I hope you guys did as well. So as for Miss Louise Peete Judson, aged 59, well, she was eventually executed in the gas chamber of San Quentin on the 11th of April in 1947. And that, my friends, is the story of Louise Peete, who was said to be kind, soft-spoken, nice, but was ultimately a serial killer. Wow, this story, I haven't done a woman killer in a while, and I was excited to find one. I was so surprised at how many people died around this woman. I could not figure out, is she killing these men, or does she just have the worst luck ever? But then to find out that she was actually pretty happy with herself or boasted about the men who had killed themselves in her life, like, you have to have some kind of twisted pathology to be proud of yourself for that. So I don't know, either she was very good at faking kindness and being quiet and seeming so innocent, or she really was quiet and maybe used to be kind, but for some reason that all changed. I hope you guys enjoyed this story, and I also did as well. I hope you guys enjoyed learning about the gas chamber, and I hope that you guys will join me next week for another episode of The Kill File. I will see you guys next time. Thank you for sticking around. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Well, that's it for today, you guys. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and listening to another episode of The Kill File. Don't forget to check out the merch shop, either at thekillfile.com and click Shop Merch, or you can visit thekillfile.printify.me/products for some awesome true crime merch. Also, follow along on the Kill File's socials for posts about episodes, pictures about the cases, for updates, and more. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and X as The Kill File, and we are on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out the website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host. You can learn a little bit more about how The Kill File got started, and you can suggest a case right there on the website. Let me know in your case suggestion if you want me to shout out your name if I cover your case. There is contact info on the site as well. You guys have no idea how much I love to hear from you. It makes my whole day. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.